All right, so here are the 6 facets of executive function. And you have this in front of you, so I'm not going to read each one. Remember that they drive each other. It's not a hierarchy. I put it in a list like this because it's easier to read, but I have it like a rainbow because they all kind of work, they all work together. Activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. And all of them are equally important. And all of them are separate cognitive or emotional processes in the brain. When they all work together and coordinate together, they are our executive function. So you can keep that out in front of you after the break when we do an activity. Because I want you to be thinking about the students in your classrooms and what do you see on these facets when it's successful, and what do you see when you're not, when the students aren't being successful. So here's your mini brain lesson. All right, what is actually happening in the brain with executive function? This is a neuron. I don't have a pointer, but this is a neuron, which is a brain cell. All right, and from the time we're born, these neurons are hooking up and connecting with each other to communicate, to allow us to do all kinds of things, to process the world and to interact with the world. And it's done, and they develop these networks, all right, that the neurons communicate through neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, in an electrical transmission that goes in through, through the dendrites, down the axon, and jumps across the synapse to the next neuron. It happens in microseconds. And it's an actual physical activity in the brain. So everything we do, it's sort of mind-boggling, if you will, but everything we do is because of these neural connections in the brain. And the way our brains are organized is, if you start up at the top, you have local networks, which give you just fragments of sensory information, right? There's only 5 ways we can take in information into our brains, through our 5 senses. So the local neuron networks, they're specialized neurons that just pick up, it's meaningless fragments of information. And they're immediately fed to the regional networks, which is the green, what shows up in green there. And the regional networks start making meaningless sensory information into actual actual useful information. So for instance, we catch something out of the corner of our eye, some sort of motion. The other day I was in my car, and there was a green light over a busy street, and I started to accelerate, and just something out of the corner of my eye, I saw this motion. And what happened in my brain, thankfully, is that the meaning was like, oh, that's motion, all right, off to my right. And then immediately that information, that motion that I sensed visually, went to the integrative networks in my brain, which update the information about the world. So what happened was, oh, that's motion. Oh, I'm in a car in an intersection. And then it jumps to my executive function. So what happened in my executive function? Instant, right? What happened was it activated all these different things of, oh my God, danger. What do I do? Right? Put on the brake. But I had to make a decision, right? Do I accelerate to get across, or do I put on the brake? Oh my God, it's all happening very fast, and it's my executive function that allowed me to react in that situation. And I slammed on the brakes, and the car came flying through the intersection, going like 50 miles an hour, and I'm sure I would be dead if my brain had not processed all of that. That's the process, all right? So the information, kids are in the classroom, and there's a barrage, all of us. We have a barrage of sensory information that's coming in. And it goes through that comes in through the red bar, right? Goes through the regional networks, the integrative networks, and then into the executive function, which is what do we do with all that sensory information that's coming in. So it all filters through executive function. So how do we apply that? What are we seeing in the classroom? We have, think about it as 3 levels, all right? There's input through the senses, there's processing, and there's output. So I put the pictures up there. Let's say the input is, a little girl sees an apple, her friend has an apple for a snack, or she smells an apple, or she sees a picture of an apple in a book. And she's processing and she's thinking, oh, maybe wouldn't it be nice to give an apple to my teacher? That's what kids do. Very simple. But so the input goes in, she processes, she's thinking about it, she comes up with a goal, and then she gives an apple to her teacher. All right? So input, processing, output is what happens. And the input, we can teach in multisensory ways. Very important to use as many of the senses as we can to help kids learn, but that's not enough. And what we need to do is to help structure the processing and the production. And that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of instructional strategies, for these 2 days that we're together. So it's all in your head. And what happens to those neural networks? I have a picture of a path here because the brain networks that develop from the time that we're little, right, the more we practice something, a strategy that we've learned, the more we practice it, those neural pathways in our brains, that communication with the neurons that we talked about, get very well established so that it becomes easier and easier, and that is how we develop automaticity. So think about trying to go through a woodland path that's completely uncleared. Right? The first time you go through, it's miserable. You got cuts and scratches all over your legs, and you're sweaty, and the bugs are biting you, and you wish you'd never done it, and why did anybody make me think I could come out and do this, and I hate this, and and you slog your way through, and then you get to the other side, and you're like, Well, if you had to do it again, you had a success, you go down the path, it's still tough, right? Because you've only been down it once, and you're fighting different things, but the more you go through that path, what happens, right? It develops, it widens out, it's quicker. The first time you did it, it might have taken you an hour and a half to get from point A to point B. But once you've done this path a whole bunch of times, it's much quicker. You know exactly where you're going. You know you can be successful. It's not nearly as painful because you've established it. Same thing in the brain. And one of the things that's often missing in our classrooms is we push so fast that students don't have the time to practice, to establish those routines that allow them to be successful. So when and how does it develop? I already talked about childhood. It's interesting to know that executive function surges during puberty. There's a physical reason for that. That what happens, do you remember the picture of the neuron, and then there was the long stem called the axon? Well, because neurons communicate through electrical charges and neurotransmitters, when things are insulated, if you know anything, and I know very little, I have to say, but if you know anything about electricity, the better insulated something is, the more efficient it is. Well, what happens during puberty is the myelination process in the brain cells increases, and so that the axons, the myelin sheaths become more robust, if you will. And there's a surge in that during puberty, and it is one of the reasons why we start to see often changes in puberty. Kids are, sort of suddenly a little more responsible, a little more grown up. culturally, they're able to take on more responsibility. Some of that is because their executive skills are developing. And those executive skills develop through late adolescence, which really doesn't end until the mid-20s. So we often think of adolescence as ending, at 17 or 18. I mean, there are some people it doesn't end until they're like 35. But, but until the mid-20s, physically, the body is still growing and developing and is still in adolescence. And then, unfortunately, our executive function declines with age. Sigh. And you, I'm sure any of you who are like me and getting older yourselves, but also watching parents age or other family members, you start to see some decline in that ability. So through the lifespan, what are the interferences? Ooh, I got to talk fast. What are the interferences with executive development? And this is not just people who have a disorder. I mean, this is for anyone. There are internal interferences, illnesses, medical treatment, stress, fatigue, anxiety, depression. Think about the last time you had the flu. What happened to your goal-oriented behavior? Gone, right? The goal was just to lie in bed and have everyone leave you alone, right? So our executive function is interfered with when we're ill. It also, executive function can result, issues with executive function can result from other illnesses. Multiple sclerosis is a perfect example with some people who have MS, not all of them, but some people, the myelination in the brain declines because of the MS, and you see interferences with that. Stress, fatigue, anxiety, depression. Think about what happens to your executive function when you're completely freaked out about something, right? You got a phone call that your husband or your wife was in a car accident, and you're at school teaching. Wow, like you can't. You're not going to be functioning the way that you normally would because you've got all this anxiety and fear and stress, and you're really at that point, your goal is to figure out what's going on and to be there for your loved one, and you're not focused on what you're supposed to be doing. So things can interfere with our goal-oriented behavior. They can be things like that, like a one-shot thing, the flu, a crisis, something like that, and then it goes away. Executive function kind of returns to its regular levels. Or they can be ongoing. People who have issues with depression or severe anxiety disorders that are ongoing, that deeply affects their executive function on an ongoing basis. And it's very difficult. A lot of doctors have a hard time sussing out what's an anxiety disorder versus what's an executive function disorder. And that's an ongoing area of discussion in terms of diagnosing and providing medication for people who have problems with this. There are also external interferences with executive function, basic needs not met. Again, think about yourself, because we all have executive function. What happens in a situation where you're supposed to be paying attention and being on task and being productive, and you desperately have to go to the bathroom? What are you focused on? Yeah. You're not doing what you need to be doing. We have basic needs. Think about your student in the classroom who was beaten up at recess yesterday and is in your class and just about to go out to recess again. What's she focused on? She's not feeling safe. She's focused on. So we can have external interferences that really, and they can be specific, and we need to figure this out as teachers. It's a whole little investigative process to find, what's going on with a student. Lack of an ordered living situation. You think about kids who are in really Difficult family situations. There's no parental supervision because mom and dad are off working 3 different jobs trying to support the family, or kids who are living in a situation with a parent who may have problems and isn't able to be there for them. Absence of models, lack of instruction in how to achieve things. And I already mentioned insufficient guidance to practice and master strategies. And then something that we talk about as being a cycle of failure that we'll talk about a little bit more on this slide. You're going to see this again tomorrow, this slide. In fact, a bunch of the slides that are going to be up today, you're going to revisit in other sessions. But I put this up here, and Anne's going to talk about it tomorrow. But this is a failure cycle. And if you look up here, you start, how does it begin? It begins with an attempt, right, to do something, a goal-oriented attempt. And then you fail. And then frustration comes in. Then what do? None of us want to fail, right? So we avoid. All right? And then when we avoid, we don't have the opportunity to practice. So we don't get any better at the skill or the strategy. Then we don't feel so good about ourselves. Then look what comes next, way far down in the cycle. Then we lose our motivation. And then something that's called the Matthew effect, which is, it's called the Matthew effect based on the biblical thing of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that those who have good skills and strategies are going to improve constantly like this. Those who don't have good skills and strategies and who avoid a task, as time goes on, that gap gets wider and wider. And it's often talked about in reading, you know, kids who have fallen behind in reading. The good readers get to be better and better. The kids who have fallen behind may get a little better, but they're not closing that gap. But take a look at this cycle, and you can see that what we want to do as teachers is intervene as early as possible, right? Preferably during the attempt, so that failure doesn't happen. Because once that cycle starts, it's hard to break.
Can you repeat that last part about teachers?
I said, as teachers, what we want to do is intervene in this cycle as early as possible, preferably during the attempt, so that failure does not happen. Because we want to interfere with this cycle. If it does happen, then we need to get in there right then and work with the kids so that that cycle doesn't continue, so that they understand what happened, can change, can go back and make it better, so that we don't get sucked into this whole cycle of failure. Executive function disorder is not actually a diagnosis right now, although we're seeing it in a lot of reports. And there is a lot of talk in the research field about attention deficit disorder involves much more than just attention and hyperactivity, that it really involves all the executive functions, although that has also not been mapped out even in the new diagnostic statistic manual. But what happens, when do we get a disorder? We have to ask how pervasive are the issues, how severe, and in what contexts. What's the level of interference with success and with the self-concept? We all have executive function difficulties sometimes, all right? And it varies with context and it varies with severity. When does it become a disorder is a little fuzzy. And it has to do with how pervasive it is and how much it's interfering with success. Executive function, attention deficit disorder, and hyperactivity can show up in all of these places, or just in some of them. Again, remember that first slide, variability, inconsistency. And there are 5 interventions, really, overall categories of interventions. The medication approach, right? So, lots of kids who are on meds for ADHD is very effective. And the more that you read about brain science, the more you begin to understand how it works with the neurotransmitters in the neurons and how the neurons communicate with each other. It's very effective. It's controversial because lots of things were overprescribed and there's abuse with the older kids. There's a lot of issues with it. And I'm not really going to talk about that today, but that's one approach. The behaviorist approach is really what we're talking about today, and this is what teachers can do. It's behaviors in the classroom, attitudes and behaviors that we can start to train and change. Really, the ideal is some combination of all of these approaches. There's a naturalist approach. People talk about diet and exercise, very important, and a huge bonus to a lot of kids who struggle with these issues to have regular exercise, yoga, meditation, and things like that kind of fall into this holistic approach. So, and ideally, like with anything, a whole combination of interdisciplinary approaches is really, and that are consistent with the parents, the teachers, the doctors, if there are doctors involved, just a consistent, healthy approach to changing attitudes and behaviors into positive and productive activity is what would be the goal.